The house looked smaller than I remembered. I stood on the front porch, my duffel bag slung over one shoulder, key halfway to the lock, when the door swung open. Mom's face lit up the way it always did when I came home, like I was still 12 and returning from summer camp instead of 28 and reluctantly attending my sister's engagement party. "David!" She pulled me into one of her suffocating hugs, the kind that made me remember why I only visited twice a year. "You're just in time. Everyone's here." Everyone. That meant cousins I hadn't seen since Christmas, aunts who'd ask about my love life, and my sister Emma, who'd be glowing with that particular brand of happiness that engaged women seem to radiate. It also meant meeting him for the first time. Marcus. I'd heard about Marcus for 8 months now. Emma's phone calls were full of him. Marcus this, Marcus that. He was a lawyer, he was kind, he made her laugh, he loved hiking, he wanted kids, he was perfect. Absolutely fucking perfect. And next month he'd be walking down the aisle to marry my sister. "Where is everyone?" I asked, following Mom through the familiar hallway lined with family photos. There I was at graduation, Emma at her college send-off, the two of us as kids building sandcastles. Normal family stuff, nothing that suggested the quiet storm I'd become. "Backyard," Mom said, already pulling me toward the sliding glass doors. "Your father's manning the grill, and Emma's been waiting for you to get here so she can introduce you to Marcus properly." My stomach did something complicated. I'd seen pictures, of course. Emma had sent dozens. Marcus at a restaurant, Marcus on a hiking trail, Marcus at the beach with his arm around her, both of them squinting into the sun and smiling like they'd invented happiness. He was handsome in that effortless way some men managed. Dark hair that looked good even when it was messy, the kind of jawline that probably never required much thought, eyes that seemed genuinely kind even through a phone screen. But pictures were just pictures. They couldn't prepare you for presence. The backyard was chaos in the best way. Dad stood at the grill, beer in one hand, spatula in the other, holding court with my uncles about something involving baseball statistics. My cousins were scattered across the lawn, their kids running around with that manic energy children got at family gatherings. Emma sat at the patio table, animated and glowing, talking with her hands the way she always did when she was excited. And next to her sat Marcus. The first thing I noticed was that he was bigger than the photo suggested. Not bulky, just solid. Broad shoulders filled out his navy button-down shirt, and when he laughed at something Emma said, the sound was rich and genuine. The second thing I noticed was that he was beautiful. Not pretty boy beautiful, but beautiful in the way a well-made thing was beautiful. Like someone had taken time with him. The third thing I noticed was that he was looking at me. "David!" Emma jumped up, practically bouncing on her toes. "Finally! Come here, I want you to meet Marcus." Marcus stood as I approached, and Christ, he was tall, maybe 6'2" to my 5'10". When he extended his hand, his grip was firm, but not aggressive, warm, but not lingering, professional, safe. "David," he said, and his voice had the kind of warmth that made you want to lean closer. "I've heard so much about you. Emma talks about you constantly." "Good things, I hope," I managed, acutely aware that I was still holding his hand and that Emma was watching us with that expectant expression she got when she wanted people to like each other. "The best things." Marcus's smile was easy, unguarded. "She mentioned you're a graphic designer? I'd love to hear about what you're working on." Most people, when they found out what I did for work, either glazed over or made some comment about computers. Marcus seemed genuinely interested. His attention focused on me in a way that felt both comfortable and slightly overwhelming. "Nothing too exciting," I said, finally releasing his hand. "Mostly corporate branding stuff. Pays the bills." "He's being modest," Emma interjected, settling back into her chair and pulling me down into the empty seat across from Marcus. "David designed the logo for that restaurant chain, you know, the one with the blue and white signs. They're everywhere now." "Brewer and Sons?" Marcus leaned forward slightly, eyebrows raised. "No kidding. I eat lunch there at least twice a week. That's a great logo. Clean, memorable. It works at highway speed and on a business card." He got it. Most people didn't understand that good design was invisible. that the best logos felt inevitable rather than clever. But Marcus understood, and something in my chest loosened slightly. Thanks, I said. That's exactly what we were going for. Marcus has an eye for design too, Emma said, reaching over to squeeze his arm. You should see our apartment. He picked out half the furniture and somehow everything works together perfectly. Emma's being generous, Marcus said, but he was smiling at her with the kind of affection that made my stomach twist. I just know what I like. The conversation flowed from there. Work, the neighborhood, Emma's job at the museum, plans for the wedding, normal stuff, getting to know you stuff. But I found myself watching Marcus when he wasn't looking, cataloging details, the way he listened with his whole body, leaning in when someone was talking, how he laughed at Dad's terrible jokes with what seemed like genuine appreciation, the careful way he cut his burger, like he'd been raised with good manners and had never unlearned them. When Emma got up to help Mom bring out dessert, Marcus turned his attention back to me. So how long are you staying? He asked. Just the weekend. I'll head back to Portland Sunday night. Portland's great. I was there for a conference last year. Loved the food scene. He paused, taking a sip of his beer. Emma mentioned you live alone? It was an innocent question, the kind of thing people asked when they were making conversation, but something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Yeah, I said. Just me and my plants. Glamorous, I know. Nothing wrong with that. I lived alone for years before Emma and I moved in together. There's something to be said for having your own space. You miss it? The question slipped out before I could stop it, and for a moment Marcus looked surprised. Then something shifted in his expression, became more thoughtful, more careful. Sometimes, he said quietly. Is that terrible to admit? Not terrible, honest. We looked at each other for a beat longer than was probably appropriate. There was something in his eyes, a kind of recognition maybe, or understanding, like he saw something in me that other people missed. Then Emma was back carrying a tray of Mom's famous apple pie, and the moment broke. What are you two talking about? She asked, settling back into her seat. Just getting to know each other, Marcus said easily, but his eyes flickered to mine for just a second. Your brother's pretty interesting, Emma beamed. I told you you'd like him. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of family chaos. There were toasts and stories and the kind of gentle roasting that happened when relatives got together. Marcus fit into it all seamlessly, laughing at the right moments, asking the right questions, playing with the kids when they demanded his attention. He was good at this, good at being the perfect boyfriend, the ideal future son-in-law. But I caught him looking at me several times throughout the night. Just quick glances. Nothing Emma would notice, but I felt each one like a small electric shock. By 10 o'clock, people were starting to head home. The older relatives were the first to go, citing early mornings and long drives. Then the families with young kids who'd reached the end of their energy for maintaining public behavior. Finally, it was just the core group, Mom, Dad, Emma, Marcus, and me sitting around the patio table in the gathering dusk. I should probably head out too, Marcus said, checking his phone. Early morning tomorrow. You could just stay, Emma suggested, the way she probably had dozens of times before. Mom made up the guest room. Actually, Mom interjected, David's in the guest room. But Marcus, you're welcome to the couch, or there's an air mattress. No, it's fine, Marcus said, standing and stretching. My apartment's only 20 minutes away, but thank you for dinner, Mrs. Chen. Everything was incredible. He made the round saying goodbye, thanking Dad for the beer, promising to call Mom about some restaurant recommendation she'd insisted on giving him. When he got to me, he extended his hand again. Really good to meet you, David, he said. I hope we'll get to talk more before the wedding. Yeah, I managed. Looking forward to it. But when he shook my hand this time, his thumb brushed across my knuckles just once, so quickly I might have imagined it. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and then he was turning away, following Emma to the front door. I stayed on the patio after they left, nursing the last of my beer and listening to Mom and Dad clean up in the kitchen. The night air was warm, full of the sound of crickets and distant traffic, Normal summer evening sounds. Nothing to suggest that my world had shifted slightly off its axis. Emma came back out a few minutes later, practically glowing. "So," she said, dropping into the chair Marcus had vacated, "what do you think?" "About what?" "About Marcus, obviously. Do you like him?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her. Emma had always been the beautiful one, the outgoing one, the one who made friends easily and navigated social situations without overthinking every word. She was happy in a way that seemed effortless, and she deserved someone who could match that energy. "He seems great," I said, and meant it. "Really great. You two are good together." "I knew you'd like him." Emma's smile could have powered the neighborhood. "He was nervous about meeting you, you know. He kept asking what you were like, whether you'd approve of him." "Why would he be nervous about meeting me?" "Because you're important to me, dummy, and you're—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You're more selective than most people. You don't like everyone right away, but I could tell you two clicked." "Clicked, that was one way to put it." "Yeah," I said. "He's easy to talk to." Emma chattered for a few more minutes about wedding plans, about how excited she was, about how perfect everything was going to be. I made the right responses, asked the right questions, played the role of supportive older brother. But part of my attention was elsewhere, replaying the evening, trying to figure out what had just happened. Because something had happened. I was sure of it. After Emma went inside, I sat alone on the patio for another hour, finishing my beer and watching the stars appear. The backyard was quiet now, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant hum of the highway. I thought about Marcus's laugh, the way he'd leaned forward when I talked about my work, the careful way he'd asked about my living situation, the brief touch of his thumb across my knuckles. I was probably imagining things. I had to be imagining things. Because the alternative, that Emma's fiancé had been flirting with me, that I'd been flirting back, that there was some kind of mutual attraction happening, was impossible. Not just because he was engaged to my sister, but because guys like Marcus didn't look twice at guys like me. Except he had looked multiple times. And there had been something in his expression, something that made my chest tight and my thoughts scatter. I finished my beer and went inside, said goodnight to my parents, and retreated to the guest room. It was the same room I'd stayed in during college breaks, decorated with Mom's idea of timeless elegance, pale blue walls, white furniture, a quilt Emma and I had given her for Christmas years ago, familiar and safe. I unpacked my few things, changed into sleep shorts and a t-shirt, and tried to settle in for the night. But my mind wouldn't quiet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's face, heard the warmth in his voice when he had said my name, felt the ghost of his thumb across my knuckles. This was dangerous territory, the kind of thinking that led nowhere good. I was still lying awake at midnight when I heard movement in the house. Footsteps in the hallway, the quiet creak of floorboards, someone getting water probably, or checking that the doors were locked, normal nighttime sounds in a house full of people. But something made me get up. I opened my door quietly and padded toward the kitchen in bare feet, following the sound of quiet movement. The house was dark except for the pale light spilling from the refrigerator, and in that cool glow I found Marcus. He was standing at the counter in jeans and a t-shirt, no shoes, drinking water from one of Mom's glasses. His hair was mussed like he'd been lying down, and there was something softer about him in the dim light, less composed, more human. "Sorry," I whispered, not wanting to wake anyone. "Didn't know you were still here." He turned, not seeming particularly surprised to see me. "Emma fell asleep on the couch watching a movie. I didn't want to wake her, so I figured I'd just stay." He held up his glass. "Thirsty?" "Right." I moved to the cabinet to get my own glass, acutely aware of how small the kitchen suddenly felt. "Couldn't sleep?" "Not really. You?" "Same." We stood there in the refrigerator light, 2 feet apart, both of us holding glasses of water like we were at some midnight cocktail party. It should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. It felt suspended, dreamlike. "Good party tonight," Marcus said quietly. "Yeah." Emma seemed happy. "She was. She loves having everyone together." He paused, taking another sip of water. She talks about you a lot, you know. How proud she is of you, how talented you are. She's biased. Maybe, but she's not wrong. His voice was soft in the darkness. That logo really is great work. Thanks. We were standing closer now, though I couldn't remember either of us moving. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and expensive that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a month. Close enough to see the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his t-shirt stretched across his chest. David. His voice was barely above a whisper. Yeah? For a moment, neither of us moved. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the air conditioning cycling on. Marcus was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, something complex and careful and maybe a little desperate. Then from the living room came the sound of Emma stirring on the couch. Marcus? Her voice was sleepy, confused. Where are you? The spell broke. Marcus stepped back, running a hand through his hair. Just getting water, he called softly. Be right there. He looked at me one more time, his expression unreadable, then rinsed his glass and set it in the sink. Good night, David, he whispered. Good night. I watched him walk toward the living room, noting the way his shoulders filled out his t-shirt, the confident way he moved even barefoot in the dark. Then I was alone in the kitchen, holding my untouched glass of water and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Nothing had happened. We'd run into each other getting water, we'd exchanged maybe 50 words. It was nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. I went back to the guest room and lay in bed for another hour, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around me. From the living room came the occasional sound of quiet conversation, Emma and Marcus talking in voices too low for me to make out words. Eventually, even that stopped. I must have dozed because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the guest room windows and the smell of bacon was drifting from the kitchen. Saturday. The actual engagement party wasn't until evening, but Mom had planned a full day of family activities. Brunch, a trip to the farmer's market, preparations for the party. I showered, dressed, and made my way to the kitchen, where I found controlled chaos. Mom was manning 3 different pans on the stove while Dad sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper and staying out of her way. Emma was setting the table, humming something under her breath, and Marcus was at the counter making coffee. Morning, he said when he saw me, his tone perfectly normal. Like we hadn't stood in this same kitchen 12 hours ago in our pajamas, something unspoken crackling between us in the refrigerator light. Morning. I accepted the mug he handed me, careful not to let our fingers touch. Thanks. David, perfect timing, Mom said without turning around. Can you help me with these pancakes? I'm running out of hands. The morning passed in a blur of family activity. Brunch was loud and chaotic in the best way, with multiple conversations happening at once and everyone talking over each other. Marcus fit into it all seamlessly again, charming my aunts, discussing sports with my uncles, patiently answering the same questions about the wedding that he'd probably answered a dozen times already. But I caught him looking at me throughout the meal. Quick glances when he thought no one was watching, his eyes lingering just a beat too long before he looked away. Each time I felt that same electric jolt, that same sense of recognition. After brunch, we all piled into cars to head to the farmer's market. Emma had some vision of getting fresh flowers for the evening's centerpieces, and Mom wanted to pick up ingredients for the party. It was the kind of family outing that would have made me roll my eyes as a teenager, but now felt unexpectedly pleasant. The market was crowded, full of families and couples wandering between stalls selling everything from organic vegetables to handmade soap. Emma dragged Marcus from booth to booth, exclaiming over flowers and asking his opinion on color schemes. He indulged her with good humor, carrying her growing collection of purchases and offering feedback when asked. I found myself trailing behind them, watching their interaction with a mixture of affection and something darker. They were good together, that much was obvious. Emma's enthusiasm balanced Marcus's steadiness, and he clearly adored her. The way he looked at her, patient and fond, was exactly what she deserved. So why did I feel like I was watching something that belonged to me? You okay? I turned to find Marcus beside me. Emma had gotten distracted by a booth selling homemade jam, deep in conversation with the vendor about flavor profiles. Yeah, I said. Just people watching. You seem somewhere else. His observation was quiet, almost casual, but there was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. He was watching me with that same focused attention he'd given me the night before, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Maybe I am, I said. We looked at each other for a moment, the market crowd flowing around us. There it was again, that sense of connection, of understanding something neither of us was willing to name. Then Emma was back, holding up a jar of strawberry preserves like a trophy. Taste this, she demanded, offering us each a small spoon. It's incredible. The moment passed, but I felt Marcus's eyes on me as we sampled the jam and listened to Emma's enthusiastic review. When she decided to buy 3 jars, Marcus pulled out his wallet without being asked, adding them to his growing collection of her impulse purchases. You don't have to buy everything, Emma protested, but she was smiling. I know, Marcus said, kissing her temple. I want to. It was a sweet moment, the kind of casual intimacy that couples developed without thinking about it. But watching it made my chest tight with something I didn't want to examine too closely. The rest of the market visit passed in a pleasant haze. We bought flowers, sampled cheese, listened to a bluegrass band set up near the fountain. Normal Saturday afternoon stuff. But I was hyper-aware of Marcus's presence, of where he was in relation to me, of the sound of his laugh when Emma said something particularly ridiculous. By the time we got back to the house, it was mid-afternoon and time to start preparing for the party. This one would be bigger than the family dinner. Emma had invited friends from college, work colleagues, neighbors, maybe 40 people total, which meant the house would be packed. David, can you help me move some furniture? Dad asked as we unloaded the cars. I want to open up the living room for people to mingle. I'll help, Marcus offered, setting down Emma's flowers. So I found myself in the living room with Marcus and my father shifting couches and moving coffee tables. Dad was in full hosting mode, rearranging things according to some master plan he'd apparently developed. Marcus and I followed his directions, lifting and carrying and trying not to get in each other's way, which was harder than it should have been given that we kept ending up in close proximity. When we moved the heavy oak coffee table, Marcus took one end and I took the other, and our hands brushed on the underside as we maneuvered it around the couch. When we shifted the bookshelf to make more room, we both reached for the same spot to steady it, and his hand covered mine for just a moment. Each touch was brief, explainable, completely innocent. But they didn't feel innocent. They felt deliberate, charged with an energy that made my skin buzz. This is great, Dad said, stepping back to survey our work. Much better. Marcus, you've got a good eye for space. This arrangement is perfect. Just following your lead, Marcus said, but he was looking at me when he said it. Dad went off to check on something in the kitchen, leaving Marcus and me alone in the rearranged living room. The afternoon light was slanting through the windows, casting everything in golden tones. Thanks for the help, I said, suddenly aware that we were standing very close to each other. No problem. Marcus's voice was quiet. I like helping. There was something in the way he said it that made me look at him more carefully. He was watching me with that same complex expression from the night before, like he was trying to decide something. Marcus? Emma's voice carried from the kitchen. Can you come help me with these flowers? Coming, he called back, but he didn't move immediately. We stood there for another beat, something unspoken hanging between us before he finally stepped away. See you later, he said softly. I watched him go, then sank onto the newly positioned couch and tried to get my thoughts in order. This was getting out of hand. Whatever was happening between Marcus and me, and something was definitely happening, it needed to stop. He was engaged to my sister. In a month they'd be married. This wasn't some romantic comedy where everyone would understand and give their blessing. This was real life, where actions had consequences and families could be destroyed by the wrong choice. But knowing that didn't make it easier to ignore the way my pulse quickened when he looked at me or the way his casual touches seemed to burn through my skin. The party started at 6, and by 6:30 the house was full of people. Emma had been right about the guest count. There were at least 40 people scattered between the living room, kitchen, and backyard. Friends from various stages of her life mixed with family members and work colleagues, creating the kind of cheerful chaos that made good parties. I nursed a beer and tried to play the role of supportive brother, making conversation with Emma's friends and catching up with relatives I hadn't seen in months. But I was always aware of where Marcus was in the room, who he was talking to, whether he was looking in my direction. He was good at parties, better than good. He was magnetic. I watched him work the room, making conversation with Emma's college friends about their jobs, discussing travel with my aunt and uncle, getting into what looked like a genuinely interesting conversation with my cousin about sustainable architecture. He remembered names, asked follow-up questions, made people feel heard, and he was clearly crazy about Emma. He stayed close to her throughout the evening, his hand on her lower back or his arm around her shoulders. When someone asked about the wedding, he lit up talking about their plans, their honeymoon, their hopes for the future, the perfect fiancé. But I still caught him looking at me. It happened several times throughout the evening. I'd be talking to someone and feel eyes on me, and when I looked up, Marcus would be watching me from across the room. Our eyes would meet for just a moment before he looked away, returning his attention to whatever conversation he'd been having. Around 8 o'clock, I was in the kitchen refilling my beer when someone bumped into me from behind. I turned to find Marcus carrying an empty wine glass and looking slightly flustered. "Sorry," he said, steadying himself with a hand on my arm. "Someone just asked me a very detailed question about tax law at a party, and I needed to escape. Did you answer it?" "God, no. I redirected them to the dessert table and ran." He grinned and something in my chest fluttered. "Is it terrible that I'm hiding from my own engagement party?" "Just taking a breather. That's normal." "Right, normal." He moved to the counter next to me, reaching for an open bottle of wine. As he poured, our shoulders brushed, and neither of us moved away. "Having fun?" I asked. "Yeah, actually. Your family's great. Emma's friends are great. Everyone's great." He paused, taking a sip of wine. "What about you? Having fun?" "Sure." "You don't sound sure." I looked at him, trying to read his expression. There was something almost hopeful in his eyes, like he wanted me to say something specific. "I'm not much of a party person," I said finally. "No, you seem like you'd be good at parties." "Why?" "You're observant, good listener. People probably tell you things they don't tell other people." It was an oddly perceptive comment and accurate. People did tend to open up to me, maybe because I didn't talk much and they filled the silence. "What about you?" I asked. "You're clearly good at this." "Practice, law school, networking events, client dinners, you learn to make conversation." He leaned against the counter, angling his body toward mine. "But I'd rather be having a real conversation." "What's a real conversation?" "The kind where you don't have to perform, where you can just be yourself." There was something in his voice, a longing maybe, that made me look at him more carefully. For a moment, the noise of the party faded, and it felt like we were alone in the kitchen again, standing in the refrigerator light. "Marcus!" Emma appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless and glowing with happiness. "There you are. Mrs. Patterson wants to meet you. She's the one I told you about who knows your firm." "Of course," Marcus said smoothly, straightening up. "David, excuse me." He followed Emma back toward the living room, but not before glancing back at me one more time. I stayed in the kitchen for a few minutes, trying to collect myself before rejoining the party. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. People began leaving around 10, thanking my parents for the hospitality and congratulating Emma and Marcus again. By 11, it was just family and a few close friends cleaning up. I was carrying dishes from the living room to the kitchen when I nearly collided with Marcus in the hallway. He was carrying a stack of plates, and when we almost crashed into each other, one of them slipped. Without thinking, we both reached for it, our hands meeting around the ceramic edge. For a moment, we were very close, our faces maybe 6 inches apart, both of us holding the same plate. Got it? Marcus asked softly. Yeah, I whispered back. But neither of us let go. We stood there in the hallway, holding the plate between us close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to count his eyelashes. David? Marcus? Emma's voice broke the moment. Everything okay? We sprang apart, Marcus smoothly taking control of the plate. Just catching a runaway dish, he said easily. Crisis averted. Emma laughed, already moving past us toward the kitchen with her own armload of glasses. My heroes. Marcus and I looked at each other for just a moment. Something passed between us, an acknowledgement of what had almost happened, before following her. The cleanup took another hour. By midnight, the house was quiet, back to its normal state except for a few extra flower arrangements and the lingering smell of wine and perfume. Marcus helped until the very end, washing dishes and folding chairs like he'd been part of the family for years. You don't have to do all this, Mom protested, but she was clearly pleased by his help. I want to, Marcus said, echoing what he'd told Emma at the farmer's market. It's the least I can do after such a great party. Finally, everything was clean and put away. Dad had already headed upstairs, claiming an early morning tea time. Mom was packing leftover food into containers, insisting that everyone take something home. I should probably head out, Marcus said, checking his phone. Let you all get some rest. Are you sure you don't want to stay? Emma asked. It's late, and you helped so much. I'm fine, Marcus assured her. But thank you. He made his rounds saying goodbye, thanking Mom and Dad again, promising to call about some family recipe Mom had insisted on sharing. When he got to me, he extended his hand for what felt like the 100th time. Great meeting you, David, he said. Really? You too. This time, when we shook hands, I was sure I didn't imagine the way his thumb brushed across my knuckles. It was deliberate, brief, but unmistakable. I'll walk you out, Emma said, threading her arm through his. I watched them go, then headed upstairs to the guest room. From the front porch came the sound of quiet conversation, then a car door closing and an engine starting. Marcus was gone. I got ready for bed mechanically, brushing my teeth and changing into sleep clothes while trying not to think about the evening. About the way Marcus had looked at me across the crowded room. About standing close to him in the kitchen, the hallway, anywhere we'd ended up in proximity. About his thumb across my knuckles, so brief it might have been accidental but felt entirely intentional. Emma came upstairs a few minutes later and I heard her moving around in her childhood bedroom across the hall. The house settled into quiet, the kind of deep silence that came after a day full of people and noise. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wide awake despite the late hour and the long day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's face, heard his voice saying my name, felt the ghost of his touch. This was dangerous. This was the kind of thinking that led to catastrophic decisions and family dinners that would never be the same. But I couldn't stop. Somewhere around 1 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and got up to get water. The house was dark and quiet as I made my way to the kitchen, moving carefully to avoid the floorboards that creaked. I filled a glass at the sink and stood drinking it while looking out the window at the backyard, still scattered with a few forgotten napkins from the party. That's when I heard it. A quiet knock at the front door, so soft I almost missed it. I set down my glass and moved toward the sound, wondering who would be visiting at this hour. Through the front window, I could see a familiar silhouette on the porch, Marcus. My heart started beating faster as I unlocked the door and pulled it open. He was still in his clothes from the party, but his hair was mussed and there was something almost desperate in his expression. Hey, he said quietly. Sorry it's so late. I was driving home and I had to come back. Is everything okay? I don't know. He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncertain in a way I hadn't seen before. Can we talk just for a minute? I looked back toward the stairs, listening for any sound of movement from the rest of the house. Everything was quiet. Yeah, I said, stepping back to let him in. Of course. He followed me through the dark house toward the kitchen, both of us moving quietly. In the pale light from the window, He looked younger somehow, less composed than he'd been all evening. I can't stop thinking about last night, he said without preamble. In the kitchen, the way it felt. My mouth went dry. Marcus, I know this is crazy. I know this is the last thing either of us should be talking about. He was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. But I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't pretend I don't feel. He trailed off, looking at me with an expression that was part hope, part desperation. Feel what? I asked quietly. Connected to you, attracted to you. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them back all day. From the moment Emma introduced us, I felt something. And I know you felt it too. I should have denied it. Should have told him he was imagining things, that he was engaged to my sister and needed to focus on that. Should have shown him to the door and pretended this conversation never happened. Instead, I said, yeah, I felt it too. The admission hung between us in the quiet kitchen, changing everything. Christ, Marcus said softly, leaning against the counter like he needed the support. What are we doing? I don't know. Emma's upstairs. Your sister is upstairs sleeping, and I'm down here telling her brother that I'm attracted to him. He looked at me with something like anguish. What kind of person does that make me? The honest kind. The honest kind. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's one way to put it. We stood in the kitchen looking at each other, the weight of the confession settling between us. I could hear the house breathing around us, the settling of old wood, the whisper of air through vents, the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside. Normal sounds for a normal night, except nothing about this was normal. I should go, Marcus said finally. I should go home and forget this conversation ever happened. Should. But I don't want to. The words hung in the air between us. I watched Marcus struggle with himself, saw the moment when his careful composure cracked just a little more. I keep thinking about your hands, he said quietly. When we were moving furniture today, when we caught that plate, the way you touch things, careful, like you're paying attention. I keep wondering what it would feel like if you touched me like that. My breath caught. Marcus. I know this is insane. I know I'm supposed to be marrying your sister in 4 weeks. He ran both hands through his hair, leaving it even more disheveled. But I can't stop thinking about you. I wanted to cross the space between us, to reach out and touch his face, smooth the worry lines from his forehead. Instead, I stayed where I was, gripping my water glass like an anchor. What do you want me to say? I asked. I don't know. That I'm crazy, that I'm imagining this, that you don't feel anything. I can't say that. Because it wouldn't be true. Because it wouldn't be true. Marcus closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cabinet. In the pale light from the window, he looked exhausted, torn apart by wanting something he couldn't have. We can't do this, he said. I know. Emma loves me. She trusts me. She's planning a future with me. I know. Your family welcome me. Your parents like me. Your sister is happy. I know all of that. Then why does it feel like the most honest thing I've done in months is standing in this kitchen talking to you? The question hit me like a physical blow. I set down my water glass, afraid I might drop it. Maybe because it is, I said quietly. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at me, and I saw something break apart in his expression. The careful control he'd maintained all weekend crumbled, leaving something raw and desperate in its place. I was driving home, he said. Got about 5 blocks away, and I just stopped. Sat in my car at a red light, thinking about the way you looked at me tonight. The way we almost kissed in that hallway. We didn't almost kiss. Didn't we? I thought about the moment, the plate slipping, both of us reaching for it, our faces inches apart. The way time had seemed to slow, the way his eyes had dropped to my mouth for just a second before Emma's voice broke the spell. Maybe we did, I admitted. I turned around and drove back here, sat in your driveway for 20 minutes trying to talk myself out of knocking on that door. He looked at me with something like desperation. Tell me to leave, David. Tell me to go home and marry your sister and forget this conversation ever happened. I can't do that. Why not? Because I don't want you to leave. The admission hung between us, heavy and irreversible. Marcus stared at me, and I watched him make some internal decision, saw the moment when he stopped fighting whatever was pulling him toward me. "Where's your room?" he asked quietly. My heart started beating so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Upstairs, guest room at the end of the hall." "Show me." We moved through the dark house like ghosts, avoiding the floorboards that creaked, pausing at the bottom of the stairs to listen for any sound from the second floor. Everything was quiet. Emma's door was closed. My parents' door was closed. The hallway stretched before us, lit only by the moonlight filtering through the window at the far end. I led Marcus to the guest room, my hand trembling slightly as I turned the doorknob. The room was dark, furnished with the same pale furniture and careful decorating choices I remembered from my teenage years. Familiar and safe, except nothing about this moment felt safe. Marcus followed me inside, and I heard him close the door with a soft click. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room, final and irreversible. We stood there in the darkness, not touching, barely breathing. I could hear my own heartbeat, could smell his cologne mixing with the faint scent of the wine he'd been drinking at the party. The space between us felt charged, electric with possibility and terror. "I don't know what I'm doing," Marcus said quietly. "Neither do I. I've always been with women. Emma's the first person I ever thought about marrying." "Okay. But standing here with you, it feels like the first time anything has made sense in months." I wanted to ask him what that meant, wanted to understand what had brought him to my door at 1 in the morning, but talking felt dangerous, like words might break whatever fragile thing was happening between us. Instead, I reached for the lamp on the bedside table. "Don't," Marcus said softly. "Leave it dark." So we stood in the darkness, two shapes in a room that suddenly felt too small and too big at the same time. I could hear Marcus breathing, could sense him moving closer, and when his hand brushed against mine in the dark, I felt that same electric jolt I'd been feeling all weekend. "Is this okay?" he whispered. I thought about Emma sleeping across the hall, about my parents downstairs, about the wedding in 4 weeks and the life Marcus was supposed to build with my sister, about all the ways this could go wrong, all the people who could get hurt. "Yes," I said. His fingers found mine in the darkness, threading together with a care that made my chest tight. Such a simple touch, but it felt monumental. The first time we touched deliberately, without the excuse of dropped plates or shared tasks. "Your hands are shaking," he said. "So are yours." We moved toward the bed without discussing it, sitting on the edge like we were afraid it might collapse under us. The mattress dipped under our combined weight, and suddenly we were close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Marcus whispered. "Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd pushed too hard, asked the question he wasn't ready to answer. "Because I couldn't stay away," he said finally. "Because every time I looked at you this weekend, I felt something I've never felt before, because driving home tonight, all I could think about was what it would be like to touch you. And now? Now I'm terrified." I understood. The fear was everywhere, in the careful space we were maintaining between our bodies, in the way we were both sitting rigid on the edge of the bed, in the whispered quality of our voices. Fear of getting caught, fear of what this meant, fear of wanting something we couldn't have. But underneath the fear was something else, something that felt like recognition, like coming home. "Me too," I said. Marcus turned toward me, and even in the darkness, I could feel the intensity of his gaze. "Can I—" he started, then stopped. "What?" "Can I kiss you?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with everything we weren't saying. I thought about all the reasons I should say no, all the ways this was the worst possible idea. Then I thought about the way Marcus had looked at me across the crowded party, the way his touch had lingered when we moved furniture, the way he'd driven back here in the middle of the night because he couldn't stay away. "Yes," I whispered. He moved closer, slowly, giving me time to change my mind. When his hand cupped my face, his palm was warm, slightly rough with calluses I hadn't expected. He smelled like wine and cologne and something else that was purely him. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined. Soft, careful, full of questions we were both afraid to ask. His lips were warm and tentative against mine, and when I kissed him back, I felt him release a breath he'd been holding. We broke apart after a few seconds, both of us breathing hard. "Oh," Marcus said quietly. "Yeah. That was... I know." We looked at each other in the darkness, and I saw my own wonder reflected in his expression. It had been just a kiss, brief, careful, almost innocent. But it had changed something fundamental between us, crossed a line we couldn't uncross. "We should probably," Marcus started. "Probably." But neither of us moved. Instead, we sat on the edge of the bed, our hands still linked, trying to process what had just happened. "I don't regret it," Marcus said quietly. "Good." "Do you?" I thought about Emma, about the wedding, about the family dinner where Marcus would sit next to my sister and I'd sit across from them, remembering this moment. I thought about all the ways this could complicate everything, all the secrets I'd have to keep. "No," I said. "I don't regret it." Marcus squeezed my hand and we fell into silence. Outside, the world continued as normal. A car drove by, a dog barked in the distance, the house settled around us with small creaks and sighs. But inside this room, everything had shifted. "What happens now?" I asked. "I don't know." It was an honest answer, maybe the only honest answer possible. We were in uncharted territory, three people caught in a situation that had no good solutions. "Do you want to lie down?" Marcus asked quietly. It should have been a loaded question, heavy with implication, but something in his tone made it sound almost innocent, like he just wanted to be close, to extend this moment before reality intruded again. "Okay." We moved carefully, settling on top of the comforter without undressing, without doing anything that might make this more than it already was. Marcus lay on his back and I lay beside him, close enough that our shoulders touched. The ceiling was invisible in the darkness, but I stared at it anyway, hyper-aware of Marcus's breathing, of the warmth of his body next to mine. His hand found mine again, our fingers linking together on the space between us. "This is nice," he said softly. "Yeah. Just being here, with you." I turned my head to look at him and found him already watching me. In the faint light from the window, I could just make out the planes of his face, the serious expression he wore. "Do you love her?" I asked quietly. Marcus was still for a long moment, and I wondered if he'd heard me, if the question had been too quiet or too painful to answer. "I think I was trying to," he said finally. "And now?" "Now I don't know anything." His honesty was devastating. I wanted to ask him what that meant for the wedding, for Emma, for the future they'd planned together. But those questions felt too big for this moment, too heavy for the fragile thing we'd built between us. "I'm sorry," I said instead. "For what?" "For making everything complicated." Marcus turned onto his side, facing me fully. His hand came up to touch my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone. "You didn't make anything complicated," he said. "It was already complicated. I just didn't want to admit it." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a moment, his thumb still tracing gentle patterns on my skin. "I think I've been trying to convince myself that what I felt for Emma was enough," he said. "That caring about someone, respecting them, wanting to build a life with them, that all of that was the same as being in love." "Maybe it is." "Maybe, but then I met you and—" He paused, searching for words. It was like suddenly understanding the difference between thinking something is beautiful and being moved by it, between appreciating music and feeling it in your chest. His words hit me like a physical blow, beautiful and terrible at the same time. "Marcus, I know it doesn't change anything. I know I can't just call off a wedding 4 weeks before it happens because I met someone who makes me feel things I didn't know I was capable of feeling." His voice was getting quieter, more strained. "But I needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud at least once. I wanted to tell him that it did change things, that feeling like this was rare and precious and worth fighting for. I wanted to tell him that Emma deserved someone who loved her completely, not someone who was settling for enough. I wanted to tell him to choose me, choose this, choose the thing that felt like truth. Instead, I said, "I'm glad you told me." We lay there in the darkness, hands touching, barely breathing. I memorized the feeling of his thumb on my face, the weight of his body next to mine, the sound of his breathing gradually slowing. This moment felt stolen, borrowed from a life we weren't allowed to have. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. We both froze, listening. The sound came again, a soft creak from the hallway outside the guest room. Footsteps, quiet but unmistakable. Marcus's hand stilled on my face. We lay perfectly motionless, hardly daring to breathe as the footsteps moved down the hallway. They paused outside the guest room door for what felt like an eternity, and I was sure whoever it was could hear my heartbeat through the walls. Then the footsteps continued, moving toward the bathroom at the end of the hall. A door opened and closed quietly. "Bathroom," Marcus whispered. So quietly I almost didn't hear him. We waited, listening to the sound of running water, then footsteps returning down the hallway. They paused again outside the guest room, and I held my breath, certain we were about to be discovered. But then they continued, moving toward Emma's room. Her door opened and closed with a soft click. Emma. It had been Emma getting up to use the bathroom, passing within feet of where her fiancé lay in bed with her brother. We stayed frozen for several more minutes, waiting to make sure she'd gone back to sleep. When the house fell quiet again, Marcus slowly withdrew his hand from my face. "That was close," he breathed. "Too close." The near miss had broken something in the atmosphere between us, reminded us of where we were and what we were risking. Marcus rolled onto his back, putting distance between us even though we were still lying on the same bed. "I should go," he said quietly. "Should. But I don't want to." "I don't want you to either." We lay in silence, both of us staring at the invisible ceiling. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky, painting the guest room in shades of gray and silver. "It's almost morning," Marcus observed. "Yeah. Emma will be up soon. She's always been an early riser." The mention of Emma's name felt like a cold splash of reality. In a few hours, she'd be downstairs making coffee, talking about the party, planning wedding details. Marcus would go home, shower, change clothes, and probably come back for Sunday brunch like nothing had happened. "What are we going to do?" I asked. "I don't know." "We can't pretend this didn't happen. Can't we?" I turned to look at him, trying to read his expression in the growing light. He looked exhausted, torn between wanting and guilt. "Can you?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I can." "Then what?" "I don't know, David. I don't have an answer for that." The defeat in his voice made my chest ache. He was right. There was no good answer, no way to untangle the mess we'd created without someone getting hurt. "The wedding," I started, "is in 4 weeks. Emma's been planning it for months. I know. Everyone's expecting it. Your families, your friends. I know that too." We fell into silence again, the weight of the impossible situation settling over us like a blanket. Outside, birds were starting to sing, and the light through the window was growing stronger. "I should probably get some sleep," Marcus said quietly. "Emma will wonder why I look like I haven't slept." "Yeah," but neither of us moved. We lay there as the room gradually lightened around us, both reluctant to end whatever this was, to return to the world where we were Emma's brother and Emma's fiancé and nothing more. "Marcus," I said quietly. "Yeah." "Last night, when you said you couldn't stop thinking about me, did you mean it?" He turned his head to look at me, and in the growing daylight I could see the honesty in his expression. "Every word," he said. "Good." "Why good?" "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you either, from the moment Emma introduced us." Marcus closed his eyes like the admission was too much to bear. "This is so fucked up," he said quietly. "I know. She's your sister." I know. She loves me. I know. She deserves better than this. She deserves someone who loves her the way she loves them. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at me, something shifting in his expression. And what do we deserve? He asked. It was a dangerous question, loaded with implications I wasn't sure either of us was ready to face. I don't know, I said honestly, but maybe we deserve a chance to find out. The words hung between us as the sun continued to rise, painting the guest room in warm golden light. Soon the house would be awake, and we'd have to return to our assigned roles. But for now we had this: stolen time, honest words, the possibility of something neither of us had expected to find. I need to go, Marcus said finally, but he made no move to get up. I know. If I stay much longer, what? I might do something we'll both regret. Like what? Marcus looked at me with an expression so intense it made my breath catch. Like, tell you I think I'm falling in love with you. The words hit me like a physical blow, beautiful and terrible and completely devastating. Marcus, I know it's impossible. I know it doesn't change anything. He sat up, running his hands through his hair. But it's true. I wanted to tell him I was falling in love with him too, that the feeling had been building since the moment we met, growing stronger with every shared glance and careful touch. I wanted to tell him that impossible things happened every day, that people changed their minds and followed their hearts, and sometimes it worked out. Instead, I sat up beside him, close enough that our shoulders touched. What happens now? I asked again. I don't know. Will I see you again? Before the wedding? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Emma wants to have dinner next week, the three of us. She thinks it would be good for us to spend more time together, since we're going to be family. The irony was almost too much to bear. And I said yes because I'm a coward and I can't bear the thought of not seeing you again. You're not a coward, aren't I? A brave man would call off the wedding, would tell Emma the truth, deal with the consequences. He looked at me with something like desperation. A brave man wouldn't be sitting in his fiancé's brother's bed at 5 in the morning talking about falling in love. A brave man came to my door in the middle of the night because he couldn't stay away. Marcus smiled, but it was sad, full of regret. Maybe. The light was getting stronger now, and I could hear the first stirrings of movement elsewhere in the house. A door opening, footsteps in the hallway, the distant sound of coffee being made. Someone's up, Marcus said quietly. Yeah. He stood, smoothing down his clothes, running his fingers through his hair to try to make it look less like he'd been lying in bed. How do I look? He asked. Like someone who'd spent the night having his world turned upside down, like someone wrestling with an impossible choice, like someone falling in love at the worst possible time. Fine, I said. You look fine. Good. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. David? Yeah? I shouldn't have come in here. It was probably true. This conversation, this night, this growing thing between us, it was all a terrible idea that was going to hurt people we cared about. But you did, I said quietly. Marcus looked at me one last time, his expression full of everything we couldn't say, everything we couldn't have. Yeah, he said softly. I did. He opened the door carefully, checking the hallway before stepping out. I heard his footsteps moving quietly toward the stairs, then the soft sound of the front door opening and closing. He was gone. I lay back down on the bed, staring at the ceiling as the guest room filled with morning light. The sheets still smelled like his cologne, and I could still feel the ghost of his hand on my face, his fingers linked with mine. In a few hours, I'd have to go downstairs and face Emma over breakfast. I'd have to smile and make conversation and pretend that nothing had changed, that I hadn't spent the night falling for her fiancé. In a few weeks, I'd have to watch them get married, watch Marcus promise to love and cherish my sister for the rest of his life. But right now, in the growing daylight of the guest room, I allowed myself to remember the way Marcus had looked at me when he said he thought he was falling in love. I allowed myself to imagine a world where impossible things were possible, where people followed their hearts instead of their obligations, where stolen moments in dark rooms could become something real and lasting. I allowed myself to hope, even though I knew better, even though I knew it would probably destroy us all. Iye maayos